On October 1, 1993, in Las Vegas, USA, a cash transport truck loaded with $3 million was driving along the Las Vegas Strip to replenish cash for various ATMs. The vehicle stopped one by one at different casinos to prepare for the busy weekend in advance. However, when the truck arrived at the famous Circus Hotel and Casino, two employees responsible for handling the cash, Cortez Toolt and Steve, jumped out of the vehicle to replenish the casino's ATM. At that moment, the truck driver did not wait for his colleagues but instead drove out of the parking lot, disappearing with the $3 million in cash. This young driver, before applying for the driver position at the Loomis Company, had worked as a nurse. However, after her life took a strange turn and she fell in love with a man, she carried out what would become one of the most perfect heists in Las Vegas history, and then vanished without a trace, never to be found again. 3 months before the robbery, 21-year-old former nurse Heather and her 48-year-old boyfriend Roberto moved to Las Vegas, intending to start a new life. However, this would not be the typical life of an average Nevadan. They came here to carry out the most daring robbery in the history of Sin City. They rented a small apartment in the suburbs and began looking for jobs that involved handling cash. Las Vegas, known for its casinos, gambling, entertainment, and high roller culture, was the ideal place for them to execute their plan. This culture required large amounts of cash to be delivered to these establishments to serve their patrons. After nearly 3 weeks of searching, Heather finally applied for a driver position at Loomis Armored, one of the most well-known companies specializing in cash handling and secure transportation. Loomis transported millions of dollars in cash daily to hotels and casinos. Once Heather's application was approved, she got the opportunity to work at Loomis. However, at the time, she was not authorized to drive the cash truck alone. She was assigned to assist the team in their daily duties. Heather accepted any position given to her. She was a young and energetic woman who aspired to do something significant in life. Yet Heather had never imagined she would end up working at a cash handling company. She simply wanted to escape the bottom rung of life with Roberto, and quickly getting a large sum of money was the only way she saw to change their situation. That motivation came from her turbulent past, long before she met Roberto. Heather Torchief came from Buffalo, New York. He came from an extremely chaotic family. When he was still a child, his parents divorced. Until the age of 16, he lived with his father, but he never received any affection from his stepmother. His father was merely a functioning alcoholic who never paid much attention to Heather. Heather had always been the victim of the constant resentment that lingered within the family. In 1988, he decided to move to San Francisco and start a new life with his mother. Heather had always wanted to pursue a career in the medical field, so he enrolled in City College and eventually obtained his nursing certificate in 1991. He began working as a nursing assistant at a hospice for AIDS patients. Later, he applied for a full-time nursing position and started working at the California Pacific Medical Center. Heather was a very kind person, full of compassion for his patients, and took excellent care of them. At the time, he could never have imagined that just 2 years later, Heather Torchief would become the most wanted nurse in the world. After working for 2 years at the medical center, something changed. Heather's job performance began to decline drastically. He started showing signs of confusion, lack of motivation, and an overall sense of disorientation. The drastic change in his behavior was due to his beginning to abuse drugs and alcohol as a way to cope with the immense pressure he faced in his nursing job. The once most beloved and caring employee suddenly seemed to lose interest in everything. For the sake of the patient's well-being and quality of care, the medical center ultimately decided to terminate Heather's employment. After losing his job, Heather Torchief began frequenting local bars and nightclubs so he could temporarily escape his grim reality and enjoy a few pleasant moments. This nearly became a daily routine for Heather, until one night, while sitting in a nightclub in San Francisco, a man nearly 50 years old saw him standing by the bar, walked up, and offered to buy him a drink. The moment Heather saw this older man, he fell in love. Despite the man being nearly 27 years older than Heather, he couldn't resist his conversation and the aura he exuded. Heather Torchief and Roberto Solas immediately became deeply inseparable lovers. It was the most beautiful feeling Heather had ever received from a man. This man not only loved him but also possessed the maturity and stability he had always been looking for. A few days later, Heather left his mother's home and decided to move in with Roberto Solis. But the naive Heather had no idea what kind of situation he was walking into. Roberto Solis was no ordinary man. He was a convicted felon who, by all rights, should never have crossed paths with Heather in the first place. Back in 1969, he had been sentenced to life in prison. So the question arose: how did Roberto manage to get out of prison and live freely enough to be enjoying himself in nightclubs? The answer lies in how he cleverly used art and literature to escape a life behind bars. You see, in 1969, Roberto Solis and his accomplices went to a Woolworth store in San Francisco and hijacked a Loomis armored truck during a robbery. However, the cash bag they attempted to steal turned out to be completely empty. Still, Roberto flew into a rage, and in the heat of the confrontation, a security guard was fatally injured. Solis was convicted of the crime and sentenced to life in prison in August 1969. Yet Roberto was highly intelligent and articulate. During his time in prison, he devoted most of his energy to literature and poetry. Over nearly 17 years, he wrote 5 books under the pen name Pancho Aguila. During this period, he gained considerable fame and respect in the art and literary world. Many well-known poets in San Francisco wrote letters of appeal on his behalf. Professional writers praised his literary achievements, arguing they were proof of his rehabilitation. As a result, due to his good behavior and accomplishments, the parole board decided to grant him an early release in 1986. 7 years after getting out of prison, he met Heather Torchief in a nightclub and successfully won his heart. Roberto saw something special in Heather and immediately realized that he could become the perfect partner in crime, someone who could permanently change both of their lives. So, Roberto introduced Heather to the world of sensory mysticism and magic, luring him into a life of crime. Predictably, Heather embraced all of Roberto's ideas. Just a few weeks into their relationship, in July 1993, Heather and Roberto moved to Las Vegas. Roberto encouraged Heather to apply for driver positions at multiple cash transport companies so they could move their plan forward. Meanwhile, Roberto used a fake ID to rent an empty warehouse in a commercial leasing district and launched a bogus armored car retrofitting business under the guise of a steel reinforcement service. During Heather's job interview at the Loomis Armored Company office, he falsely claimed that he had previously worked as a security guard for a Las Vegas art collector named Julius, a fictional identity Roberto had fabricated. Heather's application was approved, and he began working as an assistant in one of the many armored truck teams responsible for transporting cash across Las Vegas. Seeing his professionalism on the job, his superiors soon promoted him, allowing him to drive the armored truck alone and deliver cash to casino ATMs. And this was exactly the opportunity Heather had been waiting for. The ATM delivery task not only gave Heather direct access to large amounts of money, but the cash typically lacked die packs and wasn't fitted with the standard GPS tracking systems. During nearly 3 months of working for Loomis, Heather documented delivery schedules, escape routes, and the overall security protocols. Finally, it was time to put the plan into action. Around 9 a.m. on October 1, 1993, Heather Torchief prepared for his shift that day. Instead of driving himself to the office, he took a taxi. Meanwhile, Roberto Solis cleared out their apartment and headed to the warehouse he had rented. Preparing for the heist Heather was about to execute. At the Loomis dispatch office, Heather and his 2 partners, Scott and Steve, loaded $32,000 bills, preparing to refill the ATMs at various casinos along the Las Vegas Strip. Around 8:45 a.m., they received dispatch approval, and Heather drove out of the Loomis cash facility, starting their rounds at the casinos along the Strip. As they approached the north end of the Las Vegas Strip, Heather finally made up his mind. Once the moment was right, he would steal the armored truck. Scott, seated in the rear of the truck, looked over the task list and directed Heather to pull over near the side of the Circus Hotel and Casino. When Steve and Scott exited the truck to replenish the casino's ATM, they instructed Heather to drive the vehicle to a secondary entrance near the slot machine building. Heather complied, parking the armored truck at the designated front lot. while Scott and Steve began servicing the ATMs inside the casino. Heather conducted his final assessment, checking nearby traffic and scanning for any police vehicles. Finally, he stepped on the gas and drove out of the casino, disappearing without a trace with over $3 million in cash, leaving his partners behind. When Steve and Scott exited the casino, they expected to see Heather waiting for them at the designated spot. But instead, they found a taxi parked there and no sign of Heather. They radioed him, asking to be picked up, but received no response. At first, they thought he might have gotten lost, stuck in traffic, or possibly involved in an accident. Scott even joked that maybe he had driven off with all the cash. After being stranded outside the casino for nearly half an hour, they called the office. The Loomis office sent a small truck to retrieve them and also contacted the Las Vegas Police Department and the FBI to begin searching for Heather in the area. But even after some time, there was still no trace of him anywhere. Not long afterward, Heather Torchief arrived at Roberto's warehouse with the stolen armored truck, pulled it inside, and closed the garage door. Roberto had specifically set up a fake armored vehicle modification business. So when a real armored truck drove in, none of the neighbors suspected anything unusual. Inside the warehouse, the two of them quickly began unloading the cash, placing it into small cardboard boxes, then loading those boxes into inconspicuous vehicles. They then transported all the money to Miami, Florida. After that, Heather and Roberto put on disguises, wigs, makeup, and dressed as a patient and a doctor. Heather got into a wheelchair while Roberto hailed a taxi. They quickly hopped in and told the driver to rush them to a private quarantine airstrip near McCarran International Airport, claiming it was a medical emergency. Days before the robbery, Roberto had already booked a private charter plane for October 1st to ensure there would be no delays during their escape. In case of any unforeseen events, when they arrived at the makeshift airstrip, they quickly got out of the taxi, generously tipped the driver, and boarded the plane. The pilot immediately started the engines, and the plane took off shortly after, heading directly to Denver, Colorado. They stayed in Denver for a few days before flying to their final destination in the United States, Miami, Florida. From there, they hired another private plane and left the country. No one ever found them again. Back in Las Vegas, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation into the armored truck robbery. However, they soon realized that Heather Torchief had likely already left Las Vegas the very same day. Using the address Heather had listed on his job application, the FBI tracked down his temporary residence and conducted a raid. There, they found nothing but empty closets and a few pieces of furniture. However, the forensic team did find a second set of fingerprints on the furniture, besides Heather's. After analyzing the prints in the lab, they confirmed that they matched those of Roberto Solis. It was at that moment the FBI finally realized the mastermind behind this perfectly executed robbery was none other than Roberto Solis himself. A few days later, they traced the rented warehouse back to Roberto. When they opened the garage door, they found the Loomis armored truck parked in the empty space. Besides the truck, they discovered empty cardboard boxes, Heather's work vest, and about $3.100 in $100 bills. They also found a receipt for a charter flight from Las Vegas to Denver and a mailing receipt addressed to Miami. When the FBI flew to Denver in search of Heather and Roberto, they couldn't find either of them. What they didn't realize was that the trip to Denver had been a deliberate decoy to throw authorities off their trail. So they placed their hopes on the Miami mailing address. There, they found 2 forged passports. The names on the passports were Nicole Marie and Joseph Anthony. Both passports bore visa stamps from Suriname, a country in South America. International authorities attempted to locate Heather and Roberto in Suriname, but all their efforts led to disappointment. By this point, Heather Torchief had become one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States, and indeed the world. Months passed, turning into a year, and a year turned into a decade. The FBI finally began to realize that they had failed to catch an ordinary woman who had escaped right under their noses with millions of dollars. After deceiving the FBI with a trail of dead-end clues, Heather and Roberto fled to Amsterdam, where they began a new life under new names and identities, of course, still with millions of dollars. However, about a year later, Heather became pregnant with Roberto's child. That was when her maternal instincts were awakened. After the child was born, she finally decided to leave Roberto because she didn't want her son to grow up in a chaotic environment like she did. She was tired of Roberto's controlling and manipulative nature. So Heather and Roberto went their separate ways. Roberto took all the money, leaving Heather to survive under the alias Donna Marie Eden, working as a hotel maid just to support herself and her son. On September 15, 2005, in Las Vegas, a woman in her 30s walked into the U.S. Marshal's office and said, "Hello, my name is Heather Catherine Torchief. I'm here to turn myself in for the crime I committed." When asked why, after successfully pulling off a perfect heist and escaping, especially when the FBI had effectively given up on pursuing her, she chose to surrender. She replied, "I'm doing this for my son. I believe that by turning myself in and admitting what I've done, I can give him a better life, the life he deserves. I'm tired of always being on the run. That's not really living." 2 months after her surrender, Heather was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in federal prison for bank embezzlement and credit union fraud. In 2010, after serving her sentence, she remained in Las Vegas,